To understand what's happening in Venezuela right now, you need to understand what happened over the past century. Because the current crisis, the military operation, the blockades, the diplomatic fractures, none of this is new. It's the latest chapter in a story that's been unfolding since oil was first discovered beneath Lake Maracaibo in 1922. This is a story about how a single resource can define a nation, how it can create immense wealth and immense dysfunction, how it attracts global powers, and how ultimately it makes a country dependent on forces it cannot control. Today, I'm going to walk you through the economic and geopolitical forces that made Venezuela what it is. Not the headlines, not the personalities, the structural forces, the patterns that repeat across generations, regardless of who's in power. Because removing Maduro doesn't solve Venezuela's fundamental problem. The problem is oil. And until that's understood, nothing that happens next will make sense. Let me show you how we got here, how Venezuela became an oil giant. In 1914, Caribbean Petroleum completed the Zumac-1 oil well, now called NG-1, in the Mene Grande field near Lake Maracaibo. That discovery changed Venezuela forever. Within a decade, foreign oil companies flooded into the country. Royal Dutch Shell, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, later known as Exxon, all acquired vast tracts of land. By 1928, Venezuela had become the world's leading oil exporter. By 1929, the country was producing 137 million barrels annually, making it the second largest oil producer in the world after the United States. This wasn't gradual development. This was an explosion. Venezuela went from relative anonymity to global significance in less than 15 years. By 1940, Venezuela was the third largest oil producer globally, pumping over 27 million tons per year. During World War II, as an avid supplier to the Allies, production increased 42% between 1943 and 1944 alone. And then in the decades that followed, came the discovery that would define Venezuela's future: the Orinoco Belt. The Orinoco Oil Belt, located in eastern Venezuela, contains what are now recognized as the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. According to multiple sources, including the U.S. Geological Survey, the belt holds an estimated 900 billion to 1.4 trillion barrels of heavy crude in proven and unproven deposits. Venezuela's officially certified reserves stand at approximately 304 billion barrels, roughly 18% of the world's total proven reserves as of 2020. To put that in perspective, Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than any other nation. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth beneath the ground. But there's a catch. Venezuelan oil is heavy and sour. It's thick, high in sulfur, difficult to extract, and expensive to refine. It's not the light, sweet crude that flows easily and processes cheaply. The Orinoco oil requires specialized refineries, significant infrastructure, and substantial investment to bring to market profitably. That technical reality shaped everything that came after, because possessing the resource wasn't enough. Venezuela needed foreign capital, foreign technology, and foreign expertise to turn that oil into revenue. And that dependence on external actors, on global markets, on decisions made far from Caracas, that's what made Venezuela vulnerable. How oil wealth shaped Venezuelan politics. Oil didn't just change Venezuela's economy. It restructured the entire political system. From the 1920s onward, Venezuela became what economists call a rentier state, a country that derives the majority of its national revenue from renting out natural resources rather than from producing goods or taxing a diversified economy. This has profound effects. When a government's revenue comes primarily from oil exports rather than from taxing its citizens, the relationship between the state and the population changes. The government doesn't need productive citizens. It needs to control the resource. And control it did. During the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, who ruled from 1908 to 1935, oil wealth concentrated in the hands of the government and a small elite connected to foreign companies. By 1929, Shell, Gulf Oil, and Exxon accounted for 99% of Venezuela's total oil production. The wealth was immense, but it didn't spread. Agricultural production collapsed as labor shifted to the oil fields. By the 1940s, Venezuela was importing food, despite having once been agriculturally self-sufficient. In 1943, President Isaías Medina Angarita enacted the hydrocarbons law. This was the first major step toward the government asserting more control over the oil industry. The law required oil companies to share profits approximately 50-50 with the Venezuelan government and mandated that all oil concessions revert to state control within 40 years. Despite fears from foreign companies that this would destroy the industry, production continued to increase. Venezuela served as a massive supplier of oil throughout World War II and the post-war boom. But the 50-50 split revealed something important. Oil wealth creates political pressure. Whoever controls the oil controls the government, and whoever controls the government controls the oil revenue. This dynamic, oil revenue funding the state controlling access to oil revenue, political power consolidating around that control, this became the pattern that would define Venezuelan politics for the next 80 years. In 1960, Venezuela played a founding role in creating OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Venezuelan Oil Minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, concerned about chronically low oil prices in the 1950s, proposed coordinating with other oil-producing nations to stabilize prices and assert more control over global oil markets. This was Venezuela asserting itself as a major player in the global energy system, not just a supplier, a power. By the 1970s, oil accounted for over 90% of Venezuela's export earnings. The economy was completely dependent on a single commodity. And when oil prices rose during the 1973 oil crisis, Venezuela's revenue exploded. That wealth fueled massive government spending, infrastructure projects, social programs, subsidies, the Venezuelan government became the primary economic actor in the country, distributing oil wealth through state employment and public services. But this created a structural problem. When oil prices are high, the government can spend freely. When oil prices fall, the entire system collapses. There's no diversified tax base. There's no manufacturing sector generating independent revenue. There's just oil. And if oil revenue drops, everything stops. This is the resource curse. Immense wealth from a single commodity creates economic dependency, undermines other industries, and makes the entire nation vulnerable to price shocks it cannot control. And it creates corruption. Because when the government controls access to billions of dollars in oil revenue, the incentive to capture that control through elections, through coups, through patronage networks becomes overwhelming. Oil didn't just fund the Venezuelan government, it defined it. The 1976 nationalization and the creation of PDVSA. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. President Carlos Andrés Pérez signed a law transferring ownership of all oil operations to the state and creating Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA, as the national oil company. Foreign companies like Exxon, Gulf Oil, and Mobil, which had invested over $5 billion in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, received what was described as marginal compensation. The era of direct foreign control was over. PDVSA became one of the largest and most technically competent oil companies in the world. At its peak, it operated refineries, managed complex logistics, and exported oil to dozens of countries. Venezuelan petroleum engineers were among the most skilled in the industry. But nationalization also meant that PDVSA became a political entity. Its revenue didn't go to shareholders, it went to the Venezuelan government. And that meant every government had an incentive to use PDVSA as a source of funding for political projects. During the 1980s, oil prices collapsed. The global oil glut caused by increased production, reduced demand, and greater energy efficiency in developed countries devastated Venezuela's economy. By 1992, 4 out of 5 Venezuelans lived in poverty. The 1990s saw attempts to open the oil industry to private investment again. PDVSA signed joint ventures with foreign companies. Production increased, but the political tensions remained because oil wealth was still the prize, and whoever controlled the government controlled PDVSA. Then in 1999, Hugo Chavez became president, and everything changed. Chavez and the politicization of PDVSA. Hugo Chavez ran on a platform of using Venezuela's oil wealth to fund social programs for the poor. He called it the Bolivarian Revolution, and he meant it. In the early 2000s, Chavez moved to assert direct political control over PDVSA. When PDVSA management resisted, he fired them. In 2002 and 2003, during a national strike and attempted coup, thousands of PDVSA workers walked off the job. Chavez responded by dismissing approximately 18,000 employees, nearly half the company's workforce. Many of those fired workers were engineers, geologists, and technical specialists. They were replaced with political loyalists who had little or no experience in the oil industry. This gutted PDVSA's technical capacity. The company that had once been among the most competent in the world became a patronage machine. Political loyalty mattered more than expertise. At the same time, Chavez diverted enormous amounts of PDVSA revenue to fund social programs, missions, as he called them, housing, healthcare, education, food subsidies. Oil money flowed directly into these programs, bypassing normal budget processes. When oil prices spiked in the mid-2000s, reaching over $100 per barrel, Venezuela's revenue exploded. Between 1998 and 2008, the government received approximately $325 billion from oil production and exports. That money funded an expansion of government programs, subsidies, and state control over the economy. But when oil prices fell again, starting in 2014, the system collapsed. PDVSA couldn't maintain production because it lacked investment, technical expertise, and functional infrastructure. Equipment broke down, wells went offline, production plummeted. Oil output, which had peaked at over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, fell to less than 900,000 barrels per day by 2024. That's a collapse of more than 70%. And with that collapse came economic disaster, hyperinflation, food shortages, medical supply shortages, mass emigration. By 2024, over 7 million Venezuelans had fled the country. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was the predictable outcome of turning a national oil company into a political tool. When technical competence is replaced with political loyalty, when revenue is diverted to fund government spending rather than reinvested in infrastructure, production collapses. And once production collapses, the entire rentier state structure fails, because without oil revenue, there's nothing left. Now let's talk about the United States. Because U.S.-Venezuela relations have always been about oil, in the early decades of the 20th century, American companies, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, others, dominated Venezuelan oil production. They wrote the laws, negotiated the concessions, and exported the crude. During the 1980s and 1990s, despite political differences, oil trade persisted. In 2008, Venezuela exported approximately 1.2 million barrels per day to the United States. Then came Chavez, and the relationship deteriorated. Chavez criticized U.S. foreign policy, formed alliances with Cuba and other anti-American governments, and used oil as a political weapon. He threatened to cut off exports to the U.S. He sold oil at discounted rates to Caribbean nations and poor communities in the U.S. to build political support. But the oil kept flowing. Because Venezuela needed the revenue, and the U.S. refineries on the Gulf Coast were specifically designed to process Venezuelan heavy crude. In 2014, under the Obama administration, the United States began imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials accused of human rights violations. These expanded in 2017 and 2018 under Trump to include financial sanctions, restrictions on PDVSA, and eventually a near total embargo on Venezuelan oil imports. By 2020, U.S. imports of Venezuelan crude had dropped to almost zero, and Venezuela's oil production, already declining, fell even further. The sanctions were designed to pressure the Maduro government. The logic was cut off oil revenue, the government collapses, democracy returns. But that didn't happen. Instead, Venezuela redirected its exports to China, to India, to other buyers willing to purchase sanctioned oil at steep discounts through a network of dark fleet tankers. The oil kept moving, just not to the United States. And that brings us to China. China's energy strategy and why Venezuela mattered. China's economy requires enormous amounts of energy. And as China grew over the past 3 decades, it needed to secure reliable oil supplies from multiple sources. Starting in the early 2000s, China began investing heavily in Venezuela. According to multiple reports, China extended over $60 billion in loans to Venezuela between 2007 and 2016. These loans were repaid in oil. Venezuela shipped crude to China at discounted rates as loan repayment. This was strategic for both countries. Venezuela needed capital to maintain oil production and fund government programs. China needed long-term access to energy supplies that wouldn't be subject to U.S. control. By the 2010s, China had become Venezuela's largest creditor and one of its largest oil customers. When U.S. sanctions cut off Venezuelan access to Western financial systems, China provided an alternative. This wasn't charity. This was energy security. China was building a portfolio of oil suppliers: Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Angola, Venezuela, so that no single disruption could cripple its economy. Venezuela, with its massive reserves and willingness to sell at discounts, fit perfectly into that strategy. And here's where the geopolitical competition becomes clear. The United States didn't just want to pressure Maduro. It wanted to deny China access to Western Hemisphere oil. It wanted to maintain control over global energy flows and ensure that Venezuela's reserves, if developed, would serve U.S. interests, not Chinese ones. This is why the current operation happened. Not because Maduro is uniquely evil, but because Venezuela's oil, sitting 90 miles from the U.S. mainland, represents a strategic asset, and the United States decided it couldn't allow that asset to remain under the control of a government aligned with China. How U.S. sanctions and oil competition influenced the crisis. So what did sanctions actually achieve? They disrupted Venezuelan oil exports. They made it harder for PDVSA to operate. They reduced the government's revenue. Production fell from over 2 million barrels per day in 2014 to less than 900,000 barrels per day in 2024. But they didn't collapse the government. They didn't restore democracy. They didn't stop oil from flowing. What they did was redirect the oil trade. Venezuela stopped selling to the United States and started selling to China, India, and others. The buyers changed. The flows adapted. The market found a way. And in the process, sanctions made Venezuela more dependent on China, not less. Because when Western financial systems and markets are closed, countries turn to alternatives, and the primary alternative is China. This is the unintended consequence. U.S. sanctions were supposed to weaken adversaries. Instead, they pushed those adversaries into closer alignment with each other. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, countries under U.S. sanctions all deepened their economic ties with China. They built alternative payment systems. They traded in yuan instead of dollars. They created networks that bypass U.S. financial control. The sanctions didn't isolate these countries. They integrated them into a China-led economic sphere. And from China's perspective, this was ideal. Sanctions created opportunities. Countries desperate for buyers would sell at discounts. Countries locked out of Western systems would embrace Chinese alternatives. So when we talk about why the current U.S. operation happened, we need to understand this context. Economic pressure through sanctions wasn't working. The government wasn't collapsing. China's access wasn't being denied. So the United States escalated from economic pressure to military action, from sanctions to airstrikes, from trying to control the oil through financial means to trying to control it through force. Why removing Maduro was never enough. And this brings us to the core problem. Removing Maduro doesn't solve Venezuela's structural issues, because Venezuela's problem isn't one man. It's oil dependency. Oil dependency creates a political system where controlling the government means controlling immense wealth. That attracts corruption. It attracts authoritarianism. It attracts foreign interference. It doesn't matter who runs Venezuela. As long as oil revenue is the only revenue that matters, as long as the government controls that revenue, as long as political power is tied to access to oil wealth, the same dynamics will repeat. You could install a democratic government tomorrow, but if that government still depends on oil revenue to function, if it still faces the same pressures, declining production, price volatility, foreign competition, corruption, it will face the same challenges Maduro faced, and Chavez before him, and every Venezuelan government since the 1920s. This is the resource curse in action. The wealth is real, but the wealth creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. Look at Norway. Norway has massive oil reserves, but Norway built a sovereign wealth fund. It invested oil revenue instead of spending it. It maintained a diversified economy. It created institutions that prevented oil wealth from corrupting the political system. Venezuela did the opposite. It spent oil revenue as fast as it came in. It allowed PDVSA to become a political tool. It undermined every other sector of the economy until nothing else functioned. And now, even if a new government takes power, even if production increases, even if foreign investment returns, the structural forces remain. The temptation to use oil revenue for short-term political gain. The pressure from foreign powers who want access to that oil. The corruption that comes with controlling billions of dollars in resource wealth. Removing Maduro was never going to solve those problems because those problems are built into the system. Venezuela as a case study. So what does Venezuela teach us? It teaches us that resource wealth is not the same as sustainable prosperity. Possessing oil doesn't make a country rich. It makes it dependent. It teaches us that economic structures matter more than individuals. You can remove leaders, but if the underlying economic system remains the same problems will recur. It teaches us that sanctions have limits. You can disrupt trade, but you can't control markets. When you cut off one route, the market builds another. It teaches us that geopolitical competition over resources is intensifying. The contest between the United States and China isn't just about military power. It's about access to energy, control over supply chains, and influence over resource-rich nations. And it teaches us that oil dependency creates political dysfunction. When a government's revenue comes from a single commodity rather than from a productive, diversified economy, the incentives are all wrong. The focus shifts from building institutions and empowering citizens to controlling the resource and distributing its wealth. This is Venezuela's tragedy. It has more oil than almost any nation on earth. And that oil has made it poorer, not richer, more vulnerable, not more powerful, more dependent, not more independent. The current crisis isn't an aberration. It's the continuation of a pattern that's been repeating for a century. Oil wealth attracts foreign powers. Foreign powers compete for access. Governments use oil revenue to maintain power. Production declines when political control matters more than technical competence. The economy collapses when oil prices fall. The cycle repeats. And now, with Maduro in U.S. custody, with the government in transition, with foreign powers maneuvering for position, the cycle continues. Because until Venezuela breaks its dependence on oil, until it diversifies its economy, builds functioning institutions independent of oil revenue, creates political systems that don't revolve around controlling a single resource, nothing will fundamentally change. The names will change, the governments will change, but the underlying forces that created this crisis, those remain. And that's the lesson, not just for Venezuela, for every nation that depends on resource wealth to survive. Dependence is vulnerability, and vulnerability in a world of great power competition is dangerous. Venezuela wasn't doomed by oil, but oil made Venezuela vulnerable. And that vulnerability has been exploited over and over by internal actors and foreign powers alike. The question now is whether the next government, whoever leads it, however it's formed, can break that cycle. Whether Venezuela can finally build an economy that doesn't revolve around a single commodity. Whether it can create institutions that serve its citizens rather than whoever controls the oil revenue. History suggests that's unlikely. Resource dependency is extraordinarily difficult to overcome. The incentives are too powerful. The wealth is too concentrated. The corruption is too entrenched. But it's not impossible. Other nations have done it. It requires deliberate policy choices, strong institutions, and the political will to resist the temptation to spend oil revenue on short-term gains. Whether Venezuela can do that remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: removing the duro was only the beginning. The real challenge, breaking the cycle of oil dependency, has barely started. And until that challenge is met, Venezuela's crisis will continue in one form or another, with one leader or another, because the problem isn't who runs Venezuela. The problem is oil.